This is a Frontline Club event recorded on 25th of June 2020. A discussion about the balance between public health versus civil liberties with Jack Stubbs, Antonella Napolitano, and Chris Yu.
I'd like to welcome our panelists tonight. Antonella Napolitano is a policy officer with Transparency International with a specialty in cybersecurity and biometrics. Chris Yu leads the technology and public policy team at the Tony Blair Institute, where he's also an executive director. And Jack Stubbs is the European cybersecurity correspondent with Reuters here in London. He's an authority on hackers, cyber surveillance, and some of the products in the pipeline that will give Big Brother everywhere new and alarming reach. I'd like to welcome all of you. Thank you for being with us. I know there are going to be lots of questions as we get going. Everybody who's logging on, know that you can type them into the question box on your screen, and I will go to them regularly and read them to our panelists. Or if you'd like to ask them yourself, you can put up your little electronic hands and I can come to you that way, and then we'll hear your voice. This is a crucial topic, a sprawling topic. We're going to get to the larger question of data and privacy in a more general context a little later, but I'm going to start by addressing the UK's so far shambolic efforts to set up a comprehensive track and trace system to control coronavirus outbreaks. To bring us up to date, I'm going to ask Chris to start, because you've been keeping an eye on this stop-start for months now, I think.
For many months, and we'll do a compressed version of the story, otherwise we'll occupy the entire session. But I guess the way that I see it is as follows. Several months ago now, we put the country, right, our entire economy and most of our society into lockdown. And you can understand absolutely why that was necessary to do in the face of a health emergency. The question becomes, as we realize that we can't sustain lockdown indefinitely, how do you reopen in a way which is going to be safe and make sure that we don't have a further wave of infections that causes us further pain and disruption down the line? So to do that, what you need is a functioning ability to test enough people to know where the prevalence of the disease is and who's at risk. Ideally, you want to know who has had it as well as who's potentially carrying it right now. You need to have the ability to trace people's contacts, because we know it's highly contagious. And of course, the difference this time compared to other infectious diseases is that people can transmit when they're asymptomatic. And then you need to have a kind of full range of measures in place to de-risk different environments. And that's everything from singing happy birthday while you wash your hands, through to proper deep cleaning of different venues and so on and so forth. So that's the ideal. Where we seem to be at is a bit of an impasse. So people listening will know that there's been sort of stops and starts, particularly around contact tracing. And for me, there's two elements of this. One is the manual system, which we've used for infectious diseases in the past. Right? You need to be able to, if somebody tests positive, interview them. A human being should interview another human being. You find out where they've been and who they've been near, and then you do the hard work of tracing those people and phoning them and asking them to isolate. And then what we wanted to do, not just in the UK, but other parts of the world, is augment this with digital contact tracing. So all the talk of using Bluetooth in people's smartphones in order to detect when people have been near each other. And in principle, this is a great idea because you're able to catch cases that would have been difficult to trace manually. For example, how are you going to find all the people you were on a crowded tube train or a bus with? And you can do it really, really quickly because the alerts go straight through the system rather than needing people to phone around. Trouble is, and I think we'll talk about this more in the session, the technology has proved a little bit more difficult than UK government thought. We've had this announcement recently that they are abandoning their initial approach and swapping out in favor of the system that Apple and Google have built into people's phones. And there are advantages and disadvantages to this, and we can talk about that more, I'm sure. And then I think the last thing to say is all of this ultimately is very tightly bound up with the question of your testing capability. If you can't test a huge number of people, it's difficult to know how widespread the virus is. And if you can't test people quickly, then frankly, there's only so many times you will listen to an app that tells you to go home and isolate. what you want is for that to happen and to be tested, and if you're not at risk, to be let out. And if you can't have that happen and people are continuously being sent home for 2 weeks, that's frustrating for the citizens, but also makes it impossible to restart your economy. So that's kind of where we are. If I had to boil it down, I would say, look, in a three-way choice between overwhelming the National Health Service, collapsing your economy, or living with an increased degree of monitoring, tracking, surveillance, if you want to call it surveillance. You may not like it, but you pick option 3 because the other 2 are too unpalatable. And then the question for policymakers is, could you do this in a responsible way, which is time limited, or do you do something which is slightly more erratic and doesn't always achieve the objective?
We think we're going to get an app in the fall that will work on our phones, that will tell us who we've been close to. There may be a system where we have to check in to pubs and restaurants and venues so that they know we've been there, and if there's an outbreak, we can be contacted. All that is an invasion of privacy. There's no question about it. Is it worth it? Antonella, what do you say? Is it privacy or health, or can we have both?
I think it's definitely not one versus the other. I think that if done well, privacy and health are complementary, not at odds. And while it probably makes for a less catchy headline, I think the effort should be in that direction. What we've seen so far, and we at Privacy International have engaged in different ways in the process. So in the UK, but also internationally, Privacy International works with a network of organizations all over the world. So we've looked at the UK, but we've also looked at these issues as played in a lot of other countries. And it's not a conflict because the choice, by definition, contact tracing and these provisions have to be privacy invasive. There is no question. So it's not like don't do anything, but all these technologies have ways to be created and deployed in a way that it's efficient. I think that there are 3 domains of challenges when we talk about apps, and this is something Chris has touched upon, and I'll expand a bit. So I think there are questions we need to ask. So do they even work? From a usage perspective, will they be used? And from a privacy perspective, do any of these apps leak data? What are the effects? And all of these questions are crucial. They're not. There is not an easy answer. And a lot of this actually, and this is something that is less technological, relies on trust. So if people don't trust the process, if people don't trust the system, if people are afraid that they're going to be damaged, trust is a crucial component. And it's a crucial component to the process, and it's a crucial component to the people and to the populations. We are in the middle of a global pandemic, but we're also in the middle, more recently, of a global conversation on racism and on police brutality. And vulnerable population, migrants population, in the UK, we've also talked about Windrush or the hostile environment. We've seen already data being used for different purposes, what we call mission creep. We're getting those data for this purpose, and then since we have it, we're using it for other purpose. This is the pervasiveness. This is why we need to ask those questions, and the policymakers need to have it like this scrutiny and transparency, which lack very often, need to be embedded in everything we do. And just taking a step aside from the UK for a minute, what we've seen, we have on the Privacy International website, and thanks to the network, we've created, quote unquote, a tracker where we're tracking policies and different kind of measures all over the world. We're not tracing personal data or anything. But what we've seen is that quarantine, apps, contact tracing, we've seen it play in different ways, and we've seen already affecting people. In Singapore, but also now in Russia, migrant workers have been affected. And as in this case, in general, but in this case more than anything, we're only as protected as the most vulnerable people and populations are. So I think this is a key issue that is not taken into account enough in the debate. We've seen it playing and having horrible effect in many countries. There is a mistrust like into government. This is why now there are some contract tracing apps starting to like being downloaded in other countries. I think the only, I mean, with except of Iceland, which is quite small, that I think had a take up of like 38%. Germany has like about 30 million people. It's still early to say if they're effective. But we're also seeing in France, for instance, which I think is the only other major EU country that has a centralized system, not a lot of cases are reported. And it might be for different reasons. It's too early to tell, but trust, I'm sure it's a factor there.
Yes. If all these things are surveillance of sorts, Jack, a lot of people fear that this is the thin edge of the wedge. Is it?
I mean, I don't know, and I don't think a lot of people do know. That's probably part of what's driving the fear, right? But I do agree that all of this is a type of surveillance, and I think it's also worth saying, perhaps controversially given the audience, but not all surveillance is bad, right? I mean, the vast majority of people would agree that in a kind of democratic society, the police, for example, have the right to stop someone suspected of crimes and ask them questions and ask them where they've been. What they probably wouldn't agree with is, you know, in the hypothetical scenario, realistically, you know, one of the best ways to contain this virus would be to put in kind of mandatory quarantines, curfews, not allowed outside the house unless you report exactly where you're going, who you're talking to. You have to wear a flashing neon lanyard that, you know, broadcasts your infection status. The vast majority of people would probably say that is too much of an infringement on our civil liberties. So, you know, I agree with large parts of what Antonella said, but I don't fully kind of follow the idea that privacy and security aren't, you know, at two separate ends of the same spectrum. And I think every security issue is basically finding a compromise between those two pulls and pushes. And it's not about it being a conflict, but it's about it being a compromise.
So let me ask you, all of you, if there is a contact tracing app issued by the NHS, will you download it? I suppose you may be in Italy, Antonella. I don't know if it applies to you, but at home, would you download such an app?
Well, I don't know. I don't know enough about this app. In Italy, there is like they have rolled out an app, and I might be seeing if it has to be like if it has to be downloaded. Members of my family have downloaded it and they're using it. Others are not doing that. I think it's also and in the case of Italy, but probably in other countries, like it's becoming a political question as well. Like if this political, like my political party is saying, like the government or the opposition, depending on where you stand for. And this is the risk. Like the risk is that it's not based on scientific evidence, but it's based on who you trust. This is why like it's really important. And I mean, just a quick like reply to Jack, it wasn't like privacy and security, it was privacy and health. I don't see them as like a balance, like, and we're seeing actually, this is again, looking globally, that coronavirus has been used to actually curtail, as an attempt, as an excuse to curtail freedom, different other rights. We've seen coronavirus used as like to curtail like a right to abortion in the US, in South America, but even European countries, and right to protest, right to work. This is like, as we're looking into like how to restart the economy, we need to be very careful that people are not gonna be damaged. Like it's not just like the economy, it's also like people's jobs. So this is why I think we should be really careful. And as we touch on security, I think one other issue that we might want to touch is the involvement of the surveillance and security industry in the process.
Mm.
I think
so,
just to jump in what Antonella was saying, I think you're completely right that over the last 3 months under, because of the COVID pandemic, there's been a huge push of surveillance powers and technologies by governments and private companies. But perhaps more interestingly, maybe worryingly, is the way it's become increasingly normalized, right? That's actually more significant, I feel, than any kind of legislation or technology, because not so long ago, if you'd said to anyone, a stranger is going to call you at some point and ask you everyone that you've spoken to in the last few weeks, the vast majority of people would have laughed you out of the room. And now, actually, I think a lot of people would take that phone call and hand over that information. So it's become that, the idea that this is normal has become increasingly accepted. And like you asked Elizabeth about the app, I'm kind of a weird but good example, because I am a bit of a privacy freak and probably more paranoid than the vast majority of people, but feel like I have reason to be, because I have some very sensitive sources and I write about some not particularly pleasant people. So I am torn. On one hand, I do think people kind of have a civic responsibility to help contain this virus, and contact tracing, track and trace is absolutely key to that. We've seen it. On the other hand, the idea that Apple, Google, or a government central database has a record of everyone I've come into contact with in the last however many months, it's just a non-starter in my line of work. So it all comes down to kind of specific individuals and then making a judgment call and your individual risk assessment. That I think is kind of security and privacy in a nutshell.
So you're not going to download the app?
I don't know, and I feel like I shouldn't say I'm not going to.
So I think
maybe I'll have two phones. I mean, on the plus side, I'm not really going to meet anyone particularly sensitive in person at the moment. So, yeah,
so I think you should download the app when it comes, because the Apple and Google implementation does not involve any central record of who you've been in proximity to, right? So the matching happens on device in a highly privacy preserving way. I think, though, what it does illustrate is this kind of bigger question around trust and understanding. And one of the things that I think has blown up version 1 of the UK's app is that we descended into a massive public argument about who would have access to the data and for what purposes, and it was all very opaque about how long it would be kept for and so on and so forth, which didn't inspire a whole bunch of confidence with the public. And we slightly triggered this conversation, which I think was just a bit of a red herring about who do you trust, the NHS or the tech companies. And I think for me personally, the truth is I trust people in the NHS to want to do the right thing. And I trust Apple and Google to be pretty good at writing software for mobile phones, right? It shouldn't be a conflict. But we're now in a place where, we're having this debate about who's going to track who and for what reason. So I, for one, will be downloading the app. I think I probably would have downloaded, in fact, I did download the test version of the original NHS app, although I'm not on the Isle of Wight, so it didn't do anything. And I think, the reality for a lot of people, I suspect, is the thing that matters most of all is that it's convenient and doesn't wipe out your battery.
Yeah.
You've got to get over that hurdle, otherwise the whole thing's a theoretical conversation.
Which is the root of all cybersecurity issues and physical security issues, is actually usability and convenience trump everything.
Yeah. And can I just add, Jack, on the thing that you mentioned about this question of getting phone calls and normalizing this activity? I think there's two levels to this, right? One is normalizing, as you say, like this additional level of monitoring in society, and whichever authority is doing that. And then the second security risk, which I think is not been well thought through, is what happens to the scam calls. And I've had the texts, and I'm sure other people have, saying this is the NHS, we're contact tracing, call this number, wire us 50 quid or whatever else to get your test. And if the best the government can do is to say that don't worry, the official NHS people will sound official, we've got a problem.
Got to bridge the cell.
Yeah, that's particularly worrying. And
I agree.
I don't think the actual volume of kind of scams or phishing messages has increased from what we've seen in our reporting, but they have all understandably completely jumped on the COVID-19 bandwagon as a lure, right? Because it really works. People are scared and they're having a lot of success compared to what they might have done previously.
Yeah, I wanted to, I only understood fairly recently that there were basically two models when you start collecting this kind of data. Let's use coronavirus app as an example. the information about where I've been and who I've been close to can either stay on my handset, and then when I get sick, I give it to the central authority and they can go about the business of finding everybody and so on. The other model, which the NHS originally wanted, was that all that information automatically goes to them. In other words, actually they had a split model, but at any rate, a stream of information from me went to them without me having any control over it. And I have to say that made me deeply uneasy. I much prefer the version that allows me to keep the stuff on my phone. Are you, do you agree? Jack,
So
I know you do.
I believe a decentralized approach, which is what you were just describing there, Elizabeth, where there is no central repository of all the information. I think that is probably for the best. I can, however, having spoken to some epidemiologists and others, I mean, actually on the issue of security, brief tangent, but last time I was allowed out of the country was to go to the Munich Security Conference in February, and you know, the coronavirus was absolutely item A on the agenda. It was very much seen as a security issue. Yeah. But so for talking to people there in particular, I can see how a centralized database makes it a lot easier for the people who are trying to keep us healthy to do their jobs. And this is it. It's a compromise and a toss-up. What we've seen, what the reality has been, is that Apple and Google decided for their own reasons, and they say they're around privacy, I think that's probably true, that they were going to push a decentralized model. And the reality is you have to go with that.
Yeah. I've got a question here from Ian Rickard, who would like to know, maybe you know a lot about this, probably Jack, what are the issues in Singapore and Russia with all the data that they've collected? I know from friends in Moscow that for a while inside Moscow City, in order to go more than 100 meters from your house, you had to actually log on to the City of Moscow website, tell them where you were going, get a barcode, and then if you were out in the street, the police could stop you and ask you to see it. And not only that, it was hooked up to the subway, to the metro, so that if you didn't show the machine your app, the barrier wouldn't open, even though you had your Metro Pass. I mean, it was really a real big brother system, probably not quite as draconian as China. But what's happened to all that data, Jack, or what could happen to it? What would be your fear? I know you've done a lot of work in Russia on Russian technology.
Yeah, I spent a long time reporting in Russia. I don't know the absolute ins and outs of that system. I do know, as of last time I spoke to my colleagues and friends a couple of weeks ago, that you have to get this QR code, basically like a hall pass, right, to leave within a few hundred meters of your house. So if you wanted to go out of town or go anywhere in the supermarket or do some exercise, you have to basically get permission, and that means that they're able to record where you're going. I don't know where the data is kept, but from my previous experience, it's almost certainly in a centralized database. Russia doesn't have the same type of privacy protection laws as we have in Europe and the West. But there was, again, Russia is a good example of this, because the first day they launched that system, they actually had to close it down 24 hours later, because the vast majority of people who signed up with fake information. Yeah, they put in fake names and addresses, and they still got issued a QR code, and then they went about their daily business. And what you have there is a society of people who are very used to making this judgment call between privacy and security, and all came down on the side of valuing privacy over health security in that case. And you know, given some of the history in that country, you can see why.
Yeah. Did anybody want to add anything to that? No. Okay, so somebody else is asking, would it be possible to keep these apps in place after the pandemic and continue to keep records of where people are, and then use them for fighting crime, for example? Turn them over to the police so that they can see who was in the vicinity of a murder or whatever. I mean, I can't believe that this participant is the first person that's occurred to. Like, the police must be just salivating.
Well, I think one of the encouraging things in all of this is that Apple and Google have been pretty clear that once the pandemic is over, the contact tracing platform exposure notification, they call it, in Android and iOS will be turned off. And you know, those sorts of moves are designed to allay exactly that kind of fear. So, I mean, I think for me, like one of the most important things in all of this is that, you know, we have a robust conversation about, you know, what you do in an emergency, and you put enough steps in place to make sure that emergency powers don't turn into permanent powers. You know, you either need a mechanism that, you know, sunsets all of these things, or you need a very active checkpoint where, you know, active positive decision is made to let them continue or to extend them. And I think, you know, some countries are going to handle that better than others, frankly. And, you know, part of the job of, you know, people working in this space is to, you know, raise those sorts of concerns and help people to understand what you're training against what.
Let's think a little bit about controls and laws and the legal framework. Jack, how is UK law keeping up with the demands and the direction of surveillance technology?
I'm afraid I'm not absolutely across the details of that, but maybe Antonella will know, because I know Privacy International has done an awful lot of work tracing this kind of stuff. Sorry to throw the ball directly across.
No, Antonella?
So when it comes to data protection, for instance, when we're looking at GDPR provisions, which would be the first thing, this, like already in GDPR provisions, there are like the exception allowed for cases like this. This is like, to get to my earlier point, there is no need to change the law, make exception to the law, as I heard in the first few weeks, because like existing law already allow that, exactly like emergency, pandemic, but in a way that it like this has to have an end. This is why, for instance, when the first version of the app was out, and we had the chance to look at it like a few hours like before we published an analysis, there were a lot of privacy issues, but also like they were talking about keeping the data for 20 years. Why do you need to keep this data for 20 years? And this gets us to the question you have to ask, like, what is the problem that you're trying to solve here? So that is the kind of law. Then when it comes to surveillance law, there is a broader conversation. I'm not sure if we want to get into that, because then we have to talk about like government surveillance and intelligence agencies, which is a broader issues. But just to keep it a bit more simple, when it comes to data protection, there is no need to change the law. There are extraordinary powers, like in the coronavirus bill. And for instance, like one thing that we've seen is that like the fines that were issued by police to people that like were out in the like in the open in a way during lockdown, they were all like deemed like all the cases, like after the review, they were like the fines were quashed, the accusation were quashed. So again, when we talk about powers, when we talk about laws, and it can be like abuse of power, it can also be that police officer didn't have the necessary like understanding of what the powers would entail. So again, when we're talking about the law, there is the law, the exception that we're trying to make. And again, this is why I'm very clear on the like not making a conflict between like one value and the other. And then there is how you implement that, and how then you can get to what we called earlier mission creep, like a bit of the question, oh, we have this, can we use it to fight crime? Can we use it to control this? And this is like the issues we're talking about. Also going forward, as we look into how we can go back to normal, how can we start traveling, how can we start going back to work? These are like the question, and these are the laws. So the laws, like they're already in place, and very often like there is no need to, yeah, sorry, Chris, I think you want to say something.
I just wanted to ask something, because like I agree, like we've clearly got, you know, laws and data protection regulations and so on and so forth in place. Do you think it's actually going to survive contact with reality? So in England, on the 4th of July, the pubs are open, the restaurants are open, the cinemas are open. I won't list everything that will be open, but the point is, we are about to ask an enormous volume of organizations and small businesses that aren't used to it to become data controllers for highly sensitive personal data. Right? And you've got the Information Commissioner's Office, but do you really think they're going to get round however many millions of businesses and organizations we're talking about and make sure they haven't, you know, stored the data insecurely or accidentally forwarded it to the wrong person? Or
well, I think this is the issue. The government is giving this burden to small businesses, and if they do something wrong, they're going to be the ones paying. So I think it's going to be a massive issues for a lot of small businesses, because
when you say small businesses, you mean subcontractors in data management?
I just mean like,
I guess you're meaning like the pub.
I mean, like, you own a small independent restaurant, and now you've got to keep a record of the names and phone numbers of all of your customers and when they were there, and not just the person who booked the table, but everybody who ate in their party. And I don't know, you write that down on a sheet of paper and you lose it. And that happens times, what, 1 million?
And
how are we gonna?
Yeah. This is the thing. I think it's going to be massively problematic, but at the same time, like, it's not something, I don't think it's enough to say, oh, well, you have to do that. You have to comply with the law. But it's in the implementation is key. So I think it's an issue that the government is asking, basically, like small business, like putting, like they are creating the conflict. It's the economy, or you complying with the law. This is problematic. This
Jack,
is highly problematic.
did you want to jump in there, Jack?
No, I just was chiming in with Chris, and I mean, I agree. And the scenario he described, and it will happen, absolutely. Breaches are kind of like data breaches are an everyday part of modern life, you know, on whether it's millions and millions of flight records from EasyJet recently, or someone who's, you know, had to store 100 phone numbers because of recently introduced contact tracing rules. It's going to happen, unfortunately.
Yeah, and there've been, I think, reports from some countries where they've done similar things, and you get the data lost and you get the data abused if you're not careful. So, you know, you have you know, someone who works in a sandwich shop or something decides they've taken a liking to one of their customers, and lo and behold, they're sending them text messages. Like, this stuff is, you know, potentially kind of dangerous. So I think there's a really difficult question about, like, the strategy the UK government has chosen requires us to collect a lot of data in order to spot these potential outbreaks and close them down. But we've not equipped, you know, we've not built the infrastructure to do that in a way which is properly safe.
Well, you made the point earlier that in order for that to work and people not to get really fed up, that you've got to be able to test everybody right away, and then let everybody, all those who are not ill, go. And that part is, at the moment, as far as I can make out, completely absent. You spoke about mission creep. There's a question here from Amanda Stone. She says, do you think there's any way the data that's being collected could eventually be sold to, for example, health insurers, to, you know, allow people who have a cleaner record to pay lower premiums, for example? I mean, because clearly the commercial market is thirsty for data.
This is like an issue that we call of data exploitation, and this is, so I mean, at the moment I don't know how the app is going to work, but there is an issue, and this is something that we've seen also in some, like NHS Trust selling those data, or better, not selling those data, but having contract with third party, what we call data brokers, and basically giving them data to recoup NHS fees. These, like the business model of these companies is buying and selling data and profiling people. So, and again, as Chris was mentioning, as we're thinking that now a lot of people are going to be collecting data and they're not going to be secure, there's going to be data breaches. It might not be like that, like it's not that the NHS is going to sell like data to a third party, but a lot of people are going to be involved into data collection and data management. And then there is a separate issue, not specifically on the app, but what we do broadly with the response. It's for instance, the NHS data store. So how we broadly manage the data. And here again, going to the point that I only touched upon a surveillance industry, there are companies that are involved in that. Companies that have a controversial history, to say the least, and also a company that until very recently, was contract were completely opaque. Like we didn't have contract like published, and it's not clear their involvement. So it's something we discussed earlier.
Are you talking about the Palantir example?
Palantir is one example. Palantir is tech companies, is a US-based Silicon Valley tech company that has a history of, let's say controversial. Like they have a huge data analytics capacity. They've worked with, they have contracts all over the world. They've been instrumental, for instance, more recently to the Trump administration immigration enforcement effort, the one that led to people being traced, but also people being like put in cage. They have a long history and a lot of cases, but now in the case of the NHS, and this is something that a lot of big tech surveillance companies are doing, they had a contract with the NHS, not for the app, for this, what is called the data, the COVID data store. The contract until very recently was not public. We know that the contract is, because this has been reported, is for £1, at least this contract. Like these are not like charities, this is not the government, this is a company. And so there is an issue of transparency, there is an issue of what is the business model, what is this company gaining? And it's not the first time. And a lot of these companies were companies that started with security and now they're pivoting into health because that's where the money is.
Yes. Yeah, I'd like to ask Jack to talk about that a little bit. The whole idea of the kind of the fuzzy border between the state and private enterprise. The state has a particular license and maybe privilege to collect data, but how sure can we be that they aren't going to end up selling it or sharing it or subcontracting the management of it to private industry that will then capitalize on it?
Well, and this goes back to the question we just asked as well, is will data be sold to insurance brokers? And the answer is it could be, and that's definitely a risk and a fear. To answer your question, Elizabeth, it comes down to the kind of the rules of the land, right, and the area you're operating in. And some countries have significantly better data protection legislation than others. Actually, we are lucky in the UK that we do have pretty robust data protection legislation. But I think it's worth noting, there's a lot of concern that this data collected by an NHS app will get sold to private industry. Private industry already have this data already. Your phone, via a multitude of different apps, is collecting thousands and thousands of data points about each and every single one of us, which include where you've been and who you've been talking to, but also which websites you've browsed, which ads you last clicked on Instagram. A lot of that data is sold on through data brokers, and it's sold to insurance companies and advertisers. So these fears are not new, and they're very merited because this thing is already happening. I think what I think is quite positive is that the conversation about privacy and data protection and security has become a lot more mainstream in the last few months because it's kind of been forced on people. It's now a huge part of our everyday lives. Whereas before it would have been a smaller conversation, probably with some of the people here, but not that kind of like broader society piece.
Yeah. Did you want to add something, Chris?
Just really a couple of things. One is, I think in this question of health data, number one, like we are heading to a world where we're going to have to, and it will be sensible to, use more data about people's health in order to provide better healthcare and keep them fit and so on and so forth. And so, the question is not whether we should use the data, but how do you make sure that the benefit accrues to individuals and, is kind of, appropriately kind of governed. And then I think the other thing to say is that, part of the answer to this is not so much in the technology, it's, other forms of regulation that also are relevant to the healthcare conversation. So part of this is a debate about how do you make sure insurance markets don't collapse because of adverse selection. So, you have to kind of take these things in the round. And I think, we sometimes box ourselves into public debate where, it's very hard to see how we make any progress, because all forms of progress potentially involve some level of risk, because we're doing something that we haven't done before. And I guess it's Jack's point from earlier that all these things have to be held in the balance. And, we need a more sophisticated conversation, I think, about, what data is being collected for what purpose, who is going to benefit, and what are the protections.
And we have to, I think, to pick up on Antonella's point, transparency is key. If, for example, in the Palantir case, there wasn't a lot of transparency until people like you started to ask tough questions, and then suddenly the thing had to be crystallized and the terms had to be made public. We're not there yet, but it is crucial that happens. Before we turn to, I want to ask Jack about surveillance generally, and where not your fears are, but what template.
I have a lot of fears, unfortunately.
I'll save that question for a minute and just tuck in this one before we turn the corner. This is again from Ian Rickard, who says, Antonella, in your introduction, you talked about migrant workers and problems with abuse of data as it applies to migrants and perhaps refugees. I'm not sure, but could you elaborate on that a little bit? Or give some examples?
Okay, yeah. Well, migrant workers, so migrant workers everywhere in the world. I mean, first of all, there is a broader conversation about migration that today is one of the defining issues of our age, and in particular of the rhetoric that has been very like harsh and discriminating and even violent for migrants and for asylum seekers and refugees. In the case of migrant workers, again, this was like the examples that I gave at the beginning on Singapore and then Russian workers. So in Singapore, for instance, the first like outbreak seemed to be contained at a certain point, but then it turned out that like it sort of restarted because migrant workers that like they work in Singapore live in like horrible condition. They live like cramped all together. They live in a way like separate from most people, but of course like people move, people travel, and migrant people are less protected and are also at the same time more vulnerable because they might be, for instance, tied to their employer because of a visa or because they are undocumented workers. So these are the people that are going to suffer, are among the people that are going to suffer the most. So migrant workers can be easily targeted, so can be easily, and also because of this kind of condition, they might not want to, for instance, share status of being
So the issue with data is that the state, at least in the case of some states in Asia, they knew exactly where those people were, even though those people didn't want to be located. Is that your point? Is that where the...
I think that they thought, and this goes maybe to the first like point I'm making in my first intervention, they thought of a solution that didn't take them into account. They thought of like things where in their there is all this side of economy like that is part, like people live in the country, people work in the country, and people move. So their solution, they at some point it seemed like they have won against the virus, but then it started again because whatever they thought, like it didn't take into account a key part of the population. But even without going as far as Singapore, like think of the UK and the hostile environment and the fact that people outside the EU, at least for now, migrants from outside the EU have to pay NHS charges. So yes, the government said, we're not gonna give additional charges to migrants that have coronavirus. But if you go to a hospital because you think you have coronavirus, and then you have something else and not coronavirus, you still have to pay your surcharge and fees, and this can be an issue. Again, this, like if we're talking about global health,
how is that linked to data? How is that a link to abuse of data?
Well, I'm not talking specifically about the app, but I mean, if we're talking data and hostile environment, there is reported that data sharing has happened between hospitals and the Home Office, for instance. So an undocumented migrant would think twice before going to a hospital. Or in general, like even in other contexts, if you're an undocumented worker, you think twice before saying you might got coronavirus, or so it wasn't specific to the. Then there are apps specific. For instance, in Russia, I was reading something about an app specific for migrant workers. I don't know, of course, where those data are going.
Yeah. All right, let's talk a little bit about surveillance. Where has surveillance is it most evolved, Jack, and most abused?
What do you mean by most evolved? Sorry.
Most comprehensive, most sophisticated, and in widest use, or any one of those?
I think in most technology advanced societies, it is incredibly widely deployed in a way that people no longer really think about because it's become so normalized. From
like the surveillance cameras.
Even more than cameras, from the phones in your pocket, Amazon Ring doorbells. Yeah, that's a great example. My bin went missing yesterday. Here's an anecdote for you. My bin went missing yesterday. Don't know where it went. Turns out my neighbor has one of those Amazon doorbells. He had the whole thing on camera. Yeah, it got blown down the street. It's fine. But I had not really, I was aware, I thought about it, but I had never really stopped and thought like, oh, every time I come in out of my house, my neighbor, who's a very nice man, but he has a video of me coming and leaving the house every day. Yeah. Wow. And this is just this is the world we live in now. What I think has been lacking, as I said earlier, is a broad and sustained conversation about all the things that Chris and Antonella and I have been saying today, which is those questions, which is, what's being collected, how is it being collected, who has access to it, what's it being used for. Those conversations have been happening, but probably not as prominently as they should be. And one of the few silver linings from this pandemic is that maybe it is becoming a bit more mainstream. I guess we'll have to see.
You've done some work on some of the tracking and surveillance technologies being developed in Israel. I wondered if you wanted to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, that's been one of the really kind of interesting subplots to the track and trace surveillance part of the COVID-19 pandemic is a lot of private companies who ostensibly make law enforcement software. So a very good example of this is an Israeli company called NSO, which makes software that can be used to compromise a phone and download all the data on that phone. And NSO say they only sell to government law enforcement agencies, and it's used widely for investigations and to catch some really bad criminals by all accounts. But it's also been found being used against journalists and civil rights activists and various other kind of members of civil society. NSO was one of the first companies that, from our reporting, we understand saw an opportunity here, where basically they discovered a second use case for their existing technology. So the same technology that can be used to track criminals can also be used to track normal people who might be suspected of being affected with COVID-19. So they started working with the Israeli government. They launched their own product. Another example is a company called Celebrite, which is widely used by police forces around the world to get access to mobile phones when you don't have the fingerprint or the key. You can crack the passcode. And we got documents of them offering this capability to the Indian police, specifically tailored for use combating the spread of COVID-19. So, which doesn't really make sense to me, but the idea being that if you go to hospital and you're diagnosed as infected, you're not willing to hand over your contacts. Well, the hospital, the police can use this software to access your phone, and they get all the data anyway. So I think that's quite a good example of, as Antonella was saying earlier, there has been a really concerted push of surveillance powers throughout the last 3 to 4 months as part of the pandemic.
Yeah, and if I can build on that, Celebrite, the same company that Jack just mentioned, is also the company that pitched the same kind of capabilities to EU government to stop the flow of migrants. And several countries are using those same technology to analyze what's in a migrant's phone that comes to the border and check, is it really what this person says he is? And it's a very problematic issue. And Celebrite is one of the companies that has been at the center of a scandal in the UK, because the police are using that same kind of technology, which is called mobile phone extraction, in the case of, in several types of crimes, as Jack was explaining, but most controversially in case of sexual violence. But they're not just asking suspects, they're also asking victims and witnesses to turn over their phones. This is as a condition to continue with the investigation. So this is why when we talk about these issues, this is very problematic. This is very dangerous for people's rights. And also in the case of this kind of, it's the same company that has a product and pitches to different kind of authorities.
Yeah, and as you make the point that the coronavirus is in some cases being used as a Trojan horse, as the pretext for selling this technology. Jack, go ahead. Sorry, I interrupted you.
I was just going to say it's again, it just illustrates the same point. The tools are the same. It's about the application, right? And most people would reasonably agree that if you have someone who's suspected of planning a terror act or something, then yeah, it's okay for the police to break into their phone. In these other cases we've just been discussing, probably not. So it's about making that judgment call.
Isn't one of the things that's changed over the last, I don't know, you know better than me, right? Whether it's 50 years or longer or shorter, but this notion that in the past, security services had overwhelming technological superiority, and the situation we find ourselves in now is that technologists and technology companies now, in some respects at least, have more power than sovereign nations. And I think, to tie it back to the contact tracing we were talking about earlier, one of the reasons that the Apple and Google platform has bolted down, as you both kind of mentioned, was that there's obviously enormous risks from contact tracing data ending up in the hands of governments that have got malicious intent. So, I guess I can completely understand why Apple and Google don't want to be in the business of adjudicating which government is trustworthy enough with our data and which ones shouldn't be allowed to have it. But then I think we were talking about this before the session started in the green room. There's a really troubling precedent here, which is that the boardrooms in Cupertino and Mountain View make a policy decision which in times gone by would have belonged to a sovereign government.
Yes. Yeah.
Apple and Google have shown with the case of the UK app that they have essentially set the app policy across the Western world, which is a decentralized format, because their technology has not worked with other people's attempts.
Just before we go any further, we've got a question here from Sophie Prus, who wants to know, could you repeat the name of the Israeli software companies you mentioned?
I wrote a very long story about this, so feel free to look it up. If you Google my name and coronavirus, something like that. But we just spoke about two companies, both Israeli. One is called NSO, which is kind of fairly famous. They're currently being sued by WhatsApp, or Facebook, for using WhatsApp to hack a large number of people. And the other company is called Celebrite.
Celebrite. And if they look up your byline, your name, Jack Stubbs and Reuters, they'll find your articles on it.
Yeah, we wrote it a month or two ago. That's my plug for the evening.
Okay, perfect. So, and just before I leave you, Jack, I wanted to go back to something you said, that the EU for the moment had very good data laws. Are you concerned that after Brexit, Britain's data laws are going to be eroded?
As I understand it, I believe GDPR is now also part of British legislation. It's again, Privacy International is one of the best resources. I'm not just saying that, one of the best resources on tracking this kind of stuff. Antonella, is that the case? Yeah.
Yeah, but with some significant exemption. So it's like GDPR has to be implemented in the national country's law, and there were certain exemptions. So, for instance, and this is one thing we're challenging with other organizations, there is an exemption regard to immigration. There is also an exemption about political parties. So there are several aspects that are a problem. I mean, it's not gonna change with Brexit, but of course, in the future, there might be a different view for the government, and there is, especially as the UK government is looking into doing different like trade deals with other countries that might be tempted, and I guess they are to weaken existing laws to make it more appealing to for trade deals.
So a few questions have come in, broadly speaking, asking what country has got it right in your view, the privacy for public health balance. What country has done it right and is succeeding in both spheres? You want to start out, Jack? Or okay, Chris.
Well, I mean, So, I mean, I guess I can give the answer which you often hear in this conversation, which is Estonia appear to be getting a large part of this right. They've got robust, secure digital identity. Your health records are digitized, but I think one of the things that's really exciting there is they are stored in a manner which every time somebody tries to access your patient data, an indelible mark is left on your records, which is a pretty strong deterrent to abuse. Right? It doesn't rule it out, but it means that if you go phishing in people's medical data, other people will know about it, including the patient themselves. So I think that would be one example. Antonella or Jack, you may have others.
Okay, Jack?
I would agree with Estonia. I don't know, unfortunately. I couldn't single out any one country, but I think mentioning Estonia was quite interesting because I do know from my reporting that people kind of across the population in the former Soviet Union and other areas of the world that have previously or only in fairly recent memory been subjected to very intense state-level surveillance. The individual citizens do tend to be a lot more aware of this stuff, and I think those conversations are had more prominently. So that's the kind of place I would look for positive stories.
Yeah, and where the government really has to work hard to maintain trust because it's not in the collective memory. It's something they've got to work at and keep good. So far, so good, I guess. Antonella, what country gets your vote for having got it right?
I think it's too early to tell. We're starting hearing about second waves in several countries. And Estonia is an interesting example, but Estonia has 1.3 million inhabitants and has already a digital ID system that is like, we cannot really compare. Like, it's not something that you can really compare when we talk about a very small country with a very high digital infrastructure, very high tech literacy. One thing we didn't mention, weirdly enough, is like how much, when we talk about contact tracing app, one issue is like how many people do they have to use it in order for it to be effective. And if we look at, so the UK is probably maybe has the biggest like smartphone adoption in the world at this stage. But even then, like, it means that a huge amount of people that own a smartphone have to download the app. And if we translate this to other countries, I'm thinking even like just of Italy, just of my country, it doesn't make any sense if you compare. It's like every owner of a smartphone has to download it. So again, when we think about solution, we also need to think about what is the infrastructure we're talking about and what is that, like, what are the issues. So I guess we'll see. Like Germany, I think is like one of the countries that has like the highest download of, but we're hearing of outbreaks, like smaller outbreaks just the other day. Israel, that Jack mentioned before, actually ended up using it, their MI5, like Shin Bet. I know you've covered that, Elizabeth. And then it was like their use of tracing was stopped by a constitutional challenge. But more recently, we were discussing this before this panel. There has been a new outbreak, and in a plot twist, in a way, the Shin Bet, the intelligence agency, doesn't really want to be involved. They rather leave it to someone else, because that also includes it's not their job, like as traditional job. It includes more scrutiny because you're dealing with with people's health, so people will want to know more. It would probably offer like a way for them to be more exposed in their techniques. So yeah,
in fact, the Israeli Prime Minister announced that he was going to be using this intelligence tracking program that had been invented for terrorists to help with coronavirus, and that's how the intelligence agencies were sort of outed by a politician. And it turned out they'd had this, they were keeping tracks of everybody all the time anyway, which came to as a huge surprise to most Israeli citizens. And thanks to various agencies, including Privacy International and pressure from inside the country, it went to the courts, and they had to put it under civilian oversight. And I'm sure that wasn't good for Shin Bet. It was a fascinating example of a country's intelligence data and surveillance program being unveiled and everybody gasping. Did you follow that, Jack?
I did, and this is a bit off topic, but a lot of my work kind of covers nation-state level hacking and cyber espionage, and it's been a very busy few months for spies of all stripes, and we're at the very kind of pointy end of surveillance now. But what there has been, right, is a global vacuum of information. There's been a huge desire and thirst for any type of knowledge about this thing, about the disease, about efforts to combat it, about what other countries are doing. And, just from our reporting on these different hacking groups we've seen, nearly all the nation-state intelligence agencies completely pivot. And, we've seen Iranian groups repeatedly targeting US drug developers. We saw a Vietnamese group actually targeting the Chinese health ministry and the Wuhan government at the end of last year and in January, months before anyone over in the UK was getting panicked about this. So there's this huge spectrum of surveillance, and at the very pointy end, it's also very busy.
Well, we've got one last question, but I think I'm going to make it the subject of a future discussions. How do we protect our personal privacy? Let's park that. That's from Caroline de Bertodano. Caroline, it's a wonderful question, but it deserves a lot more time than we have to address it now. So I'll thank you. Thanks to everybody who joined us, and certainly thanks to all our panelists. It's been so interesting. I feel we've barely scratched the surface, but fascinating all the way. Antonella, thank you. Jack and Chris.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.